Have you ever noticed how the fighters from the First and even the Second World War could shoot through the propeller of their engines without any kind of problem? Somehow the machine guns of these planes could fire without damaging the propeller blades. In fact, both the machine gun and the propellers were synchronized to achieve this. But how did they manage to synchronize? Remember, we're talking about World War I, and in those years, aviation was still in its infancy. However, the mechanism that allows the very precise synchronization between the machine gun and the propeller is in fact very simple. On June 7, 1912 in College Park, Maryland, United States, Roy Kidland along with Captain Charles Chandler had the pleasure of piloting the first military plane used by the United States in the first test of their effectiveness in history. The plane used a Lewis machine gun on one side so that Captain Chandler, the co-pilot, could operate it. In the tests, the Lewis machine gun was fired approximately 100 meters high at the center of a white cloth that was spread on the ground, being the first time in history that a machine gun was fired from an airplane. Chandler managed to land 12 shots out of the 47 that the Lewis machine gun had, showing how truly effective the new paradigm of aerial warfare was. In the ensuing years, nations motivated by the new great conflict that was emerging developed their own military aircraft. In the early years, military aircraft were used mostly for reconnaissance. However, this would begin to change in 1914, where the first aerial combats in the history of mankind took place. Contrary to what you might think, the first confirmed aircraft casualty was made by the Frenchman Roland Garros to Germany, who in August 1914, in a display of luck or perhaps great skill, wounded an enemy pilot with a pistol, causing his plane to crash to the ground. Such fortunate takedowns happened consequently in other nations. For example, on September 7th, of that same year, the Russian pilot Fyodor Nesterov got a casualty by crashing his plane into an Austrian plane, causing the Austrian plane to receive such damage that it was completely taken down. So in those days there were many planes in the air and it was clear what was needed: planes with weapons. But there was a big problem. It was not enough to just put a machine gun in front of the pilot and that's it. By the end of 1914, most of the planes had a very homogeneous design. All the designs had a very similar layout. So in general, all the planes had an engine with a propeller in front. So a machine gun could not be placed in front of the plane, and other mechanisms that allowed weapons to be placed in other positions were too complicated and therefore too heavy and unfeasible at that time. Many engineers, to find a solution to this problem, chose to completely modify the standard design of the military plane. For example, we have the French SPATSA that put the engine's propeller between the pilot and the gunner, making the gunner forward and not having to worry about damaging the propeller when shooting. But the concern came when the plane had to make a forced landing, as many pilots and or gunners ended up cut into pieces by the propeller that was in the center of the plane. Others, like the English Bristol F2, simply placed the gunner behind with the machine gun mounted on a shaft, with the only disadvantage that the enemy could not be attacked when flying towards him, allowing many times the enemy to escape, giving only a real advantage only when they were defending the British Vickers. FV5, or as they used to say at the time, Goombas, was another great solution of the time. They put the propeller at the back of the plane, making the engine push the plane instead of pulling it, having the gunner in a forward position. All these planes had very varied success. However, none managed to satisfy the need for planes that shot forward without damaging the propellers. In 1914, the aforementioned Frenchman Roland Garros designed a very good solution to the problem. In December of 1914, in his house, he set up the synchronization system designed in December of 1914 by Raymond Saulnier, basically the first of its kind. However, this used a Hopkins machine gun, and this machine gun did not have a constant rate of fire. It fluctuated, so there were times when the projectiles managed to hit the blades. Garros designed a solution for this, installing metal wedges on the plane's blades only in the areas where the projectiles could hit. And although it sounds a bit rudimentary or even stupid, this worked exceedingly well. So much so that Roland Garros obtained the first confirmed kill using a machine gun that fired through the propeller of his plane on April 1st, 1915. On April 18th of that same year, Garros was shot down by ground fire, and on the ground he tried to burn his plane so that it would not be captured, but the Germans managed to capture Garros before he could burn the plane. The modified propeller fell into German hands, and shortly after the Fokker Scourge would emerge. A legendary plane that changed the course of air warfare. The Germans, in the middle of the conflict for 6 months, achieved air superiority over the front, and until this time they gave it a name, the Fokker Scourge, or the Scourge of the Fokkers, all thanks to a synchronization system that allowed it to shoot through its propeller. This had a fairly simple operation. To understand, an MG8 machine gun had a rate of 7 shots per second, but the propeller could spin up to 20 times per second. This is a problem because the propeller could obstruct the shots at least 3 times per second. And as we mentioned earlier, the machine guns did not have a constant rate, so no matter how much the engineers tried to separately synchronize the machine gun with the propeller, this was never going to happen, and there lies the problem. So what Fokker did was connect the machine gun with the propeller and use the rotation of the propeller to operate the weapon. The first design that Fokker made was very complicated. It used a system of cams and lobes that took guidance from the propeller, but it was so complicated that each plane had to be individually calibrated in each combat, and to do this, a wooden disc was placed on the propeller and it was fired through the propeller to take the guide. This system was used only a few months, as Fokker, the creator, modernized it at the end of 1917 and basically managed to create what would be considered the first effective synchronization system in history, and this was the one that would be consequently copied and modernized in future bomber and fighter designs. Its operation was quite simple. The machine gun had a lever that sealed the fire. When the propeller was in a position where there was a blade blocking the machine gun, the fire ceased. Then, when the blade was in a correct place, it allowed the fire, and so on. This system allowed to perpetuate even more the German air supremacy until mid-1916 in Aviation, where the British would start to use planes with synchronizers much more complicated than the Fokker synchronizer, like the CC synchronizer, which used hydraulic oil to transmit the vibrations of the propeller and thus detect its position, making it synchronize with the machine gun. And this was generally good in the end. With the entry of the United States into the conflict and the use of new planes with synchronization systems by the British, the German air supremacy disappeared very quickly, and we all know how this story ended. After the First World War, other synchronization systems emerged, such as the electric ones, but little by little, the technological advance pointed to houses and bombers with larger caliber machine guns mounted on the wings of the planes, and these larger caliber machine guns did not fit in the nose of the plane, so the engineers generally opted to mount them on the wing of the plane. In the same way, there were many planes that used machine guns in the front part after the First World War, even up to the Second War. A great example would be the Mitsubishi, a 6M0, which had two 7.7mm machine guns mounted on the engine. And there was also the Soviet Yakolev Yak-9, its variant Yak-9, which had two 7.7mm machine guns.